Case 1. The Scholar, Michelle Jones. To understand the story of Michelle Jones, you have to look at two pieces of paper that should never belong to the same person. The first is a sentencing order from the mid-90s, assigning a 50-year term to a young woman in the wake of a tragedy involving her child. The second paper, arriving 2 decades later, is a recommendation for admission to a PhD program at Harvard University. But to understand how you get from a prison cell to the Ivy League, we have to stop looking at the crime and start looking at the brain. When Michelle entered the system as a teenager, she was what the courts called a criminal, but what psychologists today would call a walking AC score. ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. It is a scale used by experts to measure the depth of early trauma. Did you experience abandonment, abuse, instability? Michelle's score was off the charts. She was a victim of severe neglect, non-consensual teen pregnancy, and a life completely devoid of safety. Science tells us that when a developing brain is subjected to that level of chronic stress, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control and long-term planning, shows reduced functioning and impaired regulation. So when Michelle reached her breaking point, her brain wasn't functioning like a healthy adult's. It was in a state of biological survival mode. The state of Indiana didn't see it that way, of course. They treated her as irredeemable. They locked her away for 50 years, assuming she was broken beyond repair. In the rigid world of corrections, a 50-year sentence is usually a death knell for any hope of a future. It implies that you will enter as a young woman and leave as a senior citizen if you leave at all. But Michelle looked at that number and saw a variable, not a constant. This is where the story shifts from a tragedy to a case study in both neurology and legal strategy. Michelle didn't just serve time, she decided to hack the calendar. In Indiana, like many states, under Indiana law at the time, good time credit could cut some sentences in half for good behavior. That would have brought her 50-year term down to 25. But Michelle didn't settle for the standard reduction. She utilized a lesser-known lever in the penal code, educational sentence modification. Most inmates might shave off 6 months for a GED or a year for a bachelor's degree. Michelle, however, turned her incarceration into a relentless academic marathon. She didn't just attend classes, she mastered them. She earned a bachelor's degree from Ball State University by correspondence, but she didn't stop there. She earned certification after certification, piling up educational credits that acted as currency against her debt to society. By combining the state's statutory good time with the aggressive pursuit of every educational credit available, she effectively cut decades off what was effectively a life-defining sentence. She proved that in a rehabilitation-focused model, intellect can be the fastest key to the lock. But she wasn't just working to get out early. She was working to change who she was inside the prison without access to the internet, Google, or modern libraries. She became a historian. She led a team of inmates in a massive research project, digging through the prison's own dusty, forgotten archives. They uncovered the dark history of the Magdalene laundries, proving that the very institution holding them captive had been used to exploit women a century prior. This work did something incredible. It's what neuroscientists often describe as cognitive remodeling. You see, most prisoners just serve time, and the national recidivism rate, the rate at which they return to crime, remains dangerously high. But studies show that when a prisoner engages in deep, rigorous academic work, that number drops dramatically, in some studies approaching 0. Michelle wasn't just passing time. She was physically rebuilding the neural pathways that trauma had destroyed. Her work was so rigorous that it won the Best Paper Award from the Indiana Historical Society, an honor usually reserved for tenured professors, not women in prison jumpsuits, When she walked out of those gates in August of 2017, she hadn't just served her time, she had literally outworked the system. Harvard University's history department saw this brilliance. They selected her as one of their top candidates for the doctoral program. It should have been the ultimate victory for the American justice system. Proof that a person can be saved. But then, the internet found out. Conservative media outlets and university donors argued that a woman with her record didn't deserve a seat at the table, no matter how much she had rehabilitated herself. They argued that her past was too dark for Harvard's bright future. Under massive pressure, the university administration overruled the history department and rescinded the offer. It looked like the system had won again. The prison genius was being told to go back to the margins. But Michelle didn't break. New York University stepped up where Harvard backed down, welcoming her into their program. Today, she is a doctoral scholar at NYU, and her journey forces us to ask a difficult question, one that every taxpayer needs to consider. If the science proves that education is one of the few things that has been shown to actually repair, why do we spend so much money on cages and so little on books? Case 2, Anastasia Schmid, the zombie. While Michelle Jones fought her battle with books, our next case fought her battle with biology. We often assume that when a person sits in a courtroom staring at the jury, they are actually seeing them. But in the case of Anastasia Schmid, the lights were on, but nobody was home. In 2001, Anastazia was charged with the death of her boyfriend in Tippecanoe County. On paper, it looked like a violent crime, but in reality, it was a collision of untreated mental illness and severe trauma. Anastasia wasn't just snapping, she was suffering from a debilitating history of psychosis compounded by years of instability. By the time the police arrived, she wasn't a criminal mastermind. She was in a state of complete dissociation, and this is where the system made a profound error. Instead of stabilizing her in a hospital, she was held in jail, where medical staff placed her on a heavy cocktail of psychotropic drugs to keep her compliant for trial. This leads us to the most disturbing part of her story and a critical lesson in criminal psychology: the zombie effect. To understand why the jury hated Anastazia, we have to understand a concept called flat effect. Human beings are wired to look for emotion. If a mother loses a child or a woman kills a partner, we expect tears. We expect screaming. We expect drama. But severe trauma and heavy antipsychotic medication do the exact opposite. They sever the connection between the brain's emotional center, the limbic system, and the facial muscles. When a defendant has flat effect, they physically cannot express emotion. To a jury, this looks like cold-blooded remorselessness. It looks like evil. But medically, it is often a sign that the brain is simply shut down to survive the stress. The jury saw a monster. The doctor saw a patient in a chemical straitjacket. Because she couldn't cry and because she couldn't speak up, the jury didn't see her humanity. They handed down a verdict that sounds like a compromise, but is actually a trap. Guilty, but mentally ill. This label is supposed to guarantee treatment, but in practice, it often just means you serve your time in a regular cell. Anastasia was sentenced to 50 years. She disappeared into the Indiana prison system, another number in the count, but while her body was locked up, her mind began to clear. Over the next decade, doctors adjusted her medication. The fog lifted. She began to realize what had happened to her, that she had been tried while she wasn't really there. This brings us to the legal glitch that eventually set her free. Most people know about the insanity defense, which is about your mind during the crime, but very few people know about competency, which is about your mind during the trial. In the United States, we operate under the Dusky Standard. This rule says that to stand trial, you must be able to do two things. First, understand the proceedings against you, and second, be able to consult with your lawyer to help in your own defense. If medication makes you a zombie, you can't do either. You can't tell your lawyer, hey, that witness is lying, because you can't even process what the witness is saying. Trying someone in that state can violate constitutional standards. For 18 years, Anastazia fought to prove that her trial violated this standard. Finally, in 2019, a federal court agreed. They vacated her conviction, citing ineffective assistance of counsel. The court recognized that her lawyers had failed to challenge her competency or explain her medical condition to the jury. The system finally admitted that they had tried a woman who was mentally absent. After nearly 2 decades, Anastazia walked free. But like Michelle Jones, she didn't just leave, she took the experience with her. Today, she has become involved in theater-based advocacy for incarcerated women, notably with the Duchess of Stringtown project, helping others tell their stories. Her case teaches a frightening lesson about perception. We look for remorse in a defendant's eyes, but sometimes what looks like a cold stare is actually a silent scream for help. Case 3, the 35-year secret, Linda Darby. If you think 18 years is a long time to wait for freedom, consider the woman who decided not to wait at all. Our third case moves from the courtroom to the countryside, and it challenges everything we think we know about what makes a criminal. In 1970, Linda Darby was convicted of killing her husband in Hammond, Indiana. She was sent to the Indiana Women's Prison to serve a life sentence, but Linda didn't plan on staying. On a quiet night in March of 1972, she made a desperate move. She climbed a perimeter fence topped with a barbed wire fence. In a later interview, she recalled dropping to the ground on the other side, scratched up and bloody, before vanishing into the darkness. Usually, when a prisoner escapes, we expect a manhunt. We expect a spree of new crimes, desperate robberies, or a high-speed chase. But Linda didn't do any of that. She didn't run to a non-extradition country, and she didn't join a criminal underground. She moved to the tiny town of Pulaski, Tennessee, population 7,800, and simply became a mom. She adopted the alias Linda Jo McElroy. For the next 35 years, she wasn't a fugitive. Looking over her shoulder, she was the lady who cleaned your house and babysat your kids. She remarried, raised 2 more children, and eventually became a grandmother to 8. According to Giles County Sheriff Kyle Helton, who actually knew her, she wasn't just hiding, she was thriving. He told reporters, as far as I know, she never had any criminal history. She led a flawless life. This brings us to a fascinating psychological phenomenon, compartmentalization. Psychologists describe compartmentalization as a defense mechanism where the brain creates distinct, walled-off sections for conflicting realities. But in Linda's case, the walls weren't soundproof. While she was baking cookies and organizing church potlucks, she was secretly terrified. She admitted later, "I cried myself to sleep a lot." She lived with the constant gnawing question, what do you go back to? Where do you stop? She didn't just act rehabilitated. Psychologically, she had built a new self to survive the guilt of the old one. But technology eventually caught up with her. In 2007, Indiana launched a new fugitive apprehension unit. Using modern databases that didn't exist in the 70s, they connected Linda Darby to Linda McElroy. When the police knocked on her door in Pulaski, her neighbors were flabbergasted. Martha Slater, who lived next door, couldn't believe the grandmother with the playset in her backyard was a lifer on the run. And this is where Linda's case forces us to confront the single biggest philosophical debate in the criminal justice system: the theory of punishment. Criminologists teach that prison serves 4 purposes. First is incapacitation, keeping a dangerous person away from the public. Second is rehabilitation, fixing the behavior so they don't offend again. Third is deterrence, scaring others. And fourth is retribution, punishment for the sake of punishment. Linda's case broke this model. Did she need incapacitation? No, she lived freely for 35 years without committing any known crimes. Did she need rehabilitation? No, she held a job, raised a family, and even raised a granddaughter, from the age of 9. She had effectively self-corrected. The only reason to send her back to prison was retribution, the idea that she owed the state a debt of pain. When she was arrested, one of her neighbors, 77-year-old Alex Harwell, asked the question that defines this entire video. It makes you wonder, when someone's been out of trouble for 35 years, what's the point of putting them in jail? Linda maintained her innocence to the very end, telling reporters, "I didn't want to pay for someone else's crime, but the law is rigid." At 64 years old, the grandmother was extradited back to Indiana to finish the life sentence she started in 1970. Her story ends with a question that has no easy answer. If a prisoner can escape, fix their own life, and become a model citizen without the state's help, does that prove the prison system works? Or does it prove that, for some people, the prison is the problem? Case 4, The Science of Fire, Kristine Bunch. Linda Darby hid from the law, but our next subject was hidden by the law, buried beneath a pile of bad science. This case forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. What happens when the people we trust to interpret reality get it wrong? In 1995, Kristine Bunch was a 22-year-old mother living in an Indiana mobile home. One night, a fire tore through the structure. Kristine fought through smoke and flames toward the bedroom where her 3-year-old son, Anthony, was sleeping, but the heat was overwhelming. She barely escaped with her life. Her son did not. Before the sirens ever started, Kristine lived a quiet, modest life. Friends and family described her as deeply devoted to her child, working hard and struggling financially, but consistently prioritizing safety and stability. That before matters because it would later be reframed against her. Critics would later argue that investigators may have been influenced by socioeconomic bias. Faced with a young, low-income mother living in a mobile home, they didn't just see a tragedy, they began to infer motive. Scarcity became suspicion. Hardship became intent. Instead of asking what happened, the investigation quietly shifted toward why she might have done it. When investigators arrived at the charred remains of the home in Shelby County, they did not see an accident. They saw a crime scene. They focused on burn patterns along the floor and concluded that liquid fuel, an accelerant, must have been poured to start the fire. This is where psychology enters the forensic process, often invisibly. It's called confirmation bias, or in investigative terms, tunnel vision. Once an investigator forms an early conclusion, the brain unconsciously filters information. Neutral evidence stops registering. Only details that confirm the initial belief are noticed and remembered. If Kristine cried, it was interpreted as a performance. If she didn't, it was interpreted as coldness. Once suspicion locked in, the investigation stopped asking scientific questions and started assembling a narrative. Kristine was convicted of arson and murder and sentenced to 60 years in prison. She would spend the next 17 years in the Indiana Women's Prison, losing her 20s and 30s to a cell. But while Kristine was locked away, the outside world was undergoing a quiet scientific reckoning. In the 1990s, arson investigations often relied on indicators passed down through tradition rather than validated science. Jurors were told that puddle patterns on the floor proved the use of lighter fluid. What they weren't told was that these indicators had never been tested under controlled conditions. A modern fire science now understands a phenomenon called flashover. In a structure fire, heat accumulates near the ceiling until it reaches a critical threshold. And at that point, everything in the room ignites almost simultaneously. Modern furniture, made largely of synthetic foams and plastics, melts as it burns. That molten material drips downward, pooling on the floor and continuing to burn. To an investigator in 1995, those pools looked identical to poured gasoline, but they weren't accelerants, they were physics. For 17 years, Kristine maintained her innocence, writing letter after letter from prison. Eventually, the Center on Wrongful Convictions took notice. They brought in modern fire experts who reviewed the evidence with updated scientific standards. The conclusion was immediate and devastating. There was no accelerant. Toxicology tests were negative for gasoline. The so-called evidence of arson was nothing more than the natural behavior of fire in a confined space. In 2012, the Indiana Court of Appeals overturned Kristine Bunch's conviction. She walked out of prison a free woman, but she didn't simply move on. Kristine became a vocal advocate against junk fire science, working to ensure that outdated assumptions are never again allowed to masquerade as expertise. Her case leaves us with a sobering lesson. Science evolves. The justice system often does not. And when courts mistake certainty for truth, it isn't just evidence that burns, it's lives. Case 5. The Irony of Recovery. Lisa Livingston. To wrap up this collection, we turn to the story of Lisa Livingston. We often think of prison as the starting line for change, the place where a person finally gets their life together. Popular culture teaches us that redemption begins only after the gates close behind you. But Lisa's case forces us to confront a far more uncomfortable question. What happens when the change happens before the gates even open? In the early 2000s, Lisa Livingston was a pillar of her community in Shelby County, Indiana. After overcoming a long battle with addiction, she didn't simply step back into society, she stepped forward into responsibility. Recovery for her wasn't private. It was public, active, and service-oriented. She founded a recovery house called The Breakaway, a sanctuary for women struggling with the same demons she had once faced herself. This wasn't charity, it was infrastructure. Lisa wasn't just sober, she was effective. In psychology, this stage represents a transition from self-regulation to pro-social identity. The moment when a person stops asking, "How do I stay clean?" and starts asking, "How do I help others survive?" Research consistently shows that this phase dramatically lowers relapse risk. Purpose stabilizes behavior in ways fear never can. But while Lisa was saving lives, a clock from her past was still ticking. Years earlier, at the height of her addiction, Lisa had been involved in the manufacturing of methamphetamine. By the time the legal system finally caught up with her, the person standing before the court was no longer the person who had committed the crime. This brings us to a crucial educational concept, the lag of the legal calendar. Despite her documented transformation, the law moved mechanically. In 2014, a judge reviewed the offense, not the outcome, and cited mandatory minimum sentencing. The result was a 30-year sentence. No discretion, no weighing of rehabilitation. Human change is fluid, but the legal system operates on frozen moments. It judges you at your worst point in time, even if that point no longer reflects reality. Courts are designed to measure past actions, not future trajectories. In addiction psychology, there's a well-known phenomenon called the pink cloud. It describes the early phase of sobriety marked by intense optimism and emotional momentum. While powerful, it is also fragile. Many relapse once that initial surge fades. Lisa's case mattered because she had moved far beyond that stage. She had crossed the hardest threshold, building a stable, law-abiding identity. Yet, when Lisa was sent to the Indiana Women's Prison, it triggered what experts describe as a recovery paradox. By incarcerating a functioning recovery leader, the system wasn't increasing public safety, it was actively weakening it. One stable individual was removed, but dozens of vulnerable women lost their mentor. The reaction from the community was immediate. How does locking up someone who is measurably reducing harm serve the public good? Lisa served 10 months of that 30-year sentence before something extraordinary happened. The Indiana Supreme Court intervened. In a rare move, the court ruled that the sentence was inappropriate. In light of her character and her demonstrated value to the community, the decision acknowledged something courts rarely say out loud. Punishment that ignores transformation can become counterproductive. Rather than simply reducing her sentence, the court ordered Lisa released to house arrest, explicitly so she could return to operating her recovery program. It was an unusual moment of institutional humility, an admission from the highest court in the state that sometimes a cage isn't a cure. Lisa Livingston's story closes this collection, not with triumph, but with tension. It leaves us with a question that has no easy answer. If the goal of justice is safety, healing, and prevention, what should matter more, the crime someone committed or the harm they've already helped undo? From Michelle Jones's academic brilliance to Lisa Livingston's community leadership, these cases prove that the line between criminal and citizen is thinner than we think. We are taught that prison is a place where we put people to fix them. But as we've seen, the most profound transformations, the PhD scholars, the flawless lives on the lam, and the recovery leaders often happen in spite of the system, not because of it. These stories leave us with one final, sobering realization. If we truly believe in rehabilitation, we have to be prepared to accept it when it actually happens. We have to be willing to look past the mugshot and see the scholar, the mother, and the innovator hiding underneath. Because the ultimate paradox of prison is this: the more we treat people like they are irredeemable, the more we lose the geniuses who are just waiting for a reason to change.